Yo, what is up, guys? Will here from Fantasy Basketball Flock. I'm here with Canyon, and we've got our top 12 tiered ranked centers for Fantasy NBA for the rest of the season. We're heading into the crunch time, end of the regular season, heading into the NBA Fantasy, end of the regular season, and the playoffs as well, heading into that. So we wanted to give you our top 12 tiered rankings. Before we get into that, if you could drop a like and subscribe to the channel if you're not already, would appreciate the love there. And if you're not on Underdog Fantasy, use code Canyon, link in the description, 100% deposit match up to $100. We've got NBA regular season, heading into NBA playoffs, other sports as well, player props, promotions. Check it out. But with all that aside, let's get right into the top 12 in the first tier. Canyon, who we got?
Yeah, first tier is a tier of his own. Some people might argue differently, but I think that Nikola Jokic has to be in a tier of his own still. Even though the points per game might be down from his past MVP seasons, the usage is still there. He's getting the ball like crazy, and the offense just has to run through him on this team. He's averaging 25, 11.5 rebounds, 10 assists. A triple-double for a center is just obviously incredible. And the assist numbers, the high ceiling, the high floor that he provides consistently night in, night out is what, for me, separates him from the rest of the crop here at the center position to make him in a tier of his own, while also being a top 3, top 5 rebounder on this tier or on this list with 11.5. And yes, like I said, the points are down, but this guy is averaging a triple-double with ease, right? He's getting triple-doubles in the first half in some games through 3 quarters. It's not even a struggle for him at times. And so, when we get to crunch time here, if they need to go to their guy down low or they need to go through their best player and win some more important games, we could see the points go up as well. So to me, I think Jokic is a no-brainer, number 1 tier of his own, just because of that assist, discrepancy that he provides versus the other centers, and then obviously adding a steal a game and almost a block a game as well. So Jokic is he's super safe, he's super consistent, and it's almost too easy for him.
For sure. I will say it is funny looking back at the beginning of the season when the scoring numbers were down and, some people were kind of freaking out on, Jokic is he a bust at his, not a bust, but, does he deserve to be the number 1 clear cut fantasy, especially with the performances of other guys like Luka as well, who we won't talk about obviously in this video. But I mean, Jokic, he gets it done no matter what, for sure. But I will say next tier here, we've got Embiid. I think you could argue that Embiid would share a tier with Jokic just with what he's giving you at this point with just insane elite scoring numbers. I think that helps kind of make up for the discrepancy between the assist numbers between these two guys. And, he gives you a little bit more upside defensively as well, obviously just in the block department specifically. But I'm not going to argue. I mean, if they were in the same tier and I had it my way, we'd have Jokic ahead of him still. So I get it. But yeah, I talked about it. Embiid, second in usage, just crazy, crazy scoring numbers. We've seen him have a monster February. He's going to continue that. And two, I think from a ranking perspective, compared to where you would have it at the beginning of the season, especially when you get to kind of like the mid and end of the season, for me, I'm not as worried about, injuries as I am with a guy like Embiid, who's definitely missed more time than a guy like Jokic when we get down to kind of crunch time. I know it's still, missing a game or two can still be impactful, especially, fantasy playoffs and back-to-backs and rest nights and everything. But it matters a little bit less for me when we're kind of already at a point in the season where, there are still a decent number of games left, but, it isn't a full season we're looking at. So I've got Embiid here in the next tier, but at the top.
Yeah, that's obviously Embiid is would be the one that's knocking on the door because he is having an incredible scoring season and defensively as well. But in the same tier with Embiid, we've got Giannis at 3, along with these centers here. Obviously, we know what Giannis could provide. He might be just he's third in the same tier as Embiid, but his name is definitely circulated with the Jokic and the Embiids in these discussions because we know what the Greek Freak can do, right? He's also scoring at a high clip. He's rebounding even better than most of these guys on this list, and he does shovel in some good assist numbers here and there. He did injure his right knee Friday against the Heat. Also had that little bit of hand injury during and throughout the All-Star break, and so that's something to keep an eye on. But honestly, out of all these centers, there's a lot of injury concerns, and Giannis has been one that's notably played through, or is more willing to play through this injury. And so I'm not too concerned with Giannis moving forward. He might miss a couple games here or there, but Giannis is by no means one of these historically injury prone players that misses an extended period of time. He should be fine. And when he's on the court, you're going to get at least 30 from him with some insane rebounding numbers, and there's always a good chance that he's going to give you good assist numbers, and obviously defensively as well. So Giannis, another very consistent guy here that can kind of fill in the stat sheet and score at an insanely high clip.
Definitely. And I do want to say, before we even get into the next tier, I think you could argue that there should be like 3 or 4 blank tiers before we even move to, the next tier set of players, just with how dominant from a fantasy perspective in points leagues for sure Jokic, Embiid, and Giannis are. I think you could argue 3 or 4 tiers. But in the next tier up, we've got Anthony Davis. And, AD is one of those guys who, obviously monster start to the season, when he was healthy, and that's kind of the key thing. Missed some time, obviously, but in his return hasn't been as insanely dominant as we saw in that stretch. A lot of the Lakers role players are playing better. Obviously we've got some solid additions from them with guys like Russell, Rui, Beasley as well. But still, AD can still give you monster performances, obviously scoring and rebounding, but block numbers, this season he's averaging 2 blocks per game, and he's just one of those guys who can just kind of win you a week in a fantasy matchup just with these crazy performances he can give you. But obviously, even if per game he comes close to the top 3 guys, one thing, it's still per game, and still even per game he's still 3-4 points worse than Jokic, Embiid, and Giannis. So he's definitely in the next tier for sure, even as we get down at the end of the season here.
Yeah, I think most people know the high risk, high reward situation with Anthony Davis. Next up here in that same tier, we've got Pascal Siakam. Even though they've acquired Pirtle and he's been playing well for Toronto at that 5 spot, Siakam, he's still going to provide in several different areas. His rebounding numbers may have been, a little lowered since the arrival of Pirtle. He's averaging 8 on the season, but I think the last 5 games he's well under that. But the scoring is still there, the usage is still there, and the assist numbers are still there, averaging 6 assists on the season, and he's continuing to get his teammates involved. They have obviously a very consistent and powerful starting 5 there who all play a ton of minutes. We talk about all the time with the Raptors, but Siakam's another one of those centers that really can play almost every position. He distributes the ball very well. He can rebound very well, which I do expect those numbers to come down a little bit, but he is 5 for a reason. And then the scoring, he's just going to be one of their main scorers moving forward on this team. He's probably one of the most dynamic and savvy scorers on this team, so averaging 25 should continue to do so. So he's solidified there at 5.
Definitely. And then next up in this same tier, we do have Domantas Sabonis. And, we talk about it all the time where we refer to Sabonis as kind of a mini Jokic. And, definitely with the lower scoring numbers compared to other guys at this point on the list. But the rebounding numbers are really strong. The assist numbers are strong as well. Defensive stats, definitely not as much. But, yeah, with Sabonis, it's just been really, even with, a lot of the other Kings guys as well. He's been very, very involved offensively. He's just one of those guys who can just give you monster rebounding numbers. He can give you decent scoring games here and there. And then the assists, he just gives you a really nice floor across the board as he's kind of a main focal point of that Kings offense. So I think compared to kind of the rest of the list here, I think these kind of top 6, wrap up really high upside, consistent usage center guys.
Yeah, I think Sabonis is one of the most consistent high floor guys on this list. But next up here in the next tier, starting off with Bam Adebayo, a guy that's, kind of was forgotten about at the end of last season. He had a poor showing to kind of end the Heat season last season, but slowly and consistently, he's just, come back to what we were expecting him to be. And so whether it's, with Jimmy or without Jimmy, with Kyle or without Kyle, he's been pretty solid for this team, averaging 22, 10, and 3. And, you can look at the stats without Jimmy or with Jimmy, he's still right around these numbers. He's, 23, 10, and 4 without Jimmy. He's 21, 10, and 3 with Jimmy. So he's going to be just fine no matter how this, this roster looks. I know the Heat are notorious for having several injuries and, coming up with 8 or 9 game time decision guys most of the time. But Bam's been a very solid player for them, and he's probably one of the most athletic and versatile centers on this list.
Definitely. And next up in this tier, we've got Porzingis. And, obviously the beneficiary of, some time missed from Beal this season, just with some nagging injuries here and there. But still, even with Beal back in the lineup, he's just given pretty solid scoring games and some monster scoring games as well. He was a guy that we definitely were lower on this season, just with, the return of Beal to this Wizards team and what that would look like. But, he's been really solid and, pretty decently consistent, with how much usage goes to guys like Beal and Kuzma offensively on those team. I mean, Porzingis is, 8 for the most part. So he finds himself in this tier here below Bam.
Yeah, and then last up here at 9, we've got Vucevic, a guy who's also been kind of quiet, maybe due to the Bulls having a pretty underwhelming season. But he's had a monster rebounding year. It's really kept him around in this top tier list of centers. The 3-point numbers have been down a little bit, maybe not as high as we expected or were hoping for this season, but still averaging 18, almost 12 boards, 3 assists, and then he can obviously defend with both steals and blocks. But another quiet guy who's been a monster on the rebounds at good times. Obviously can score at a high clip, whether DeRozan or Levine are healthy, and then defend very well as well. But so Vucevic, a guy that people kind of forget about, but he having a huge rebounding year and can still score whether he's hitting the threes or not.
For sure. And then next up here in a new tier, we've got Jaren Jackson Jr., who, man, he's obviously injury to start the season, but man, he's been really solid, especially in February too here. I mean, he's increasing his scoring on the season. He's, in these February stretch, about 7-8 games played for Memphis here. He's up to 19-20 points. Man, and the block numbers, I feel like that just should be where you lead off with a guy like Jaren Jackson. Over this past 7, averaging almost 4 blocks per game on the season. He's right around 3. I know there were some, weird memes and conversations about those block numbers being boosted, but he's just a guy who's just giving those. I mean, he'll have kind of up and down games, obviously, as not really the second scoring option for Memphis. It's really going to be John, Desmond Bane, but man, I mean, the upside he can give you, he's one of those guys who can, wreck a week at this point in the tier list, just with crazy fantasy points that come from defensive stats. And for a guy who on the season is averaging 4+, that can really be a game and a week breaker.
Yeah, and speaking of which, you got another guy here that's a huge block monster, and Miles Turner in the same tier here. Turner used to be kind of one of these guys who's, stuck around in fantasy relevancy because of his blocks and, some sufficient points and rebounding numbers, I guess. But having a career year in scoring, especially as of late, I think he just came off a 40-point game against the Celtics. But Turner's been shooting at a very efficient clip and a higher rate as well, due to some injuries around the bigs in that team, but also maybe due to Halliburton helping with that as well. But Miles Turner definitely deserves to be this top 12 because of how, having a career high in scoring with all the block numbers and then managing to get, 8 boards or more a game. So Turner should definitely be in here at 11.
For sure. And then rounding out the top 12, and don't worry, we're going to talk about some honorable mentions who just missed the cut here and just deserve to be brought up in any kind of NBA fantasy top 12 center ranking list. But rounding out top 12, the end of this tier, we've got Evan Mobley, and we've gotten to see a little bit, it was a little bit weaker at the start of the season, but we've gotten to see it definitely down the stretch here in these most recent games. A little bit increased offensive scoring, which has been really nice. That was kind of the big thing we needed to see, and definitely felt like it was going to take a back seat when you bring in a guy like Donovan Mitchell, right? And you've got Mitchell, Garland there. It didn't really feel like there was going to be an opportunity this season for Mobley to have consistency from a scoring perspective. We've seen a little bit of that down the stretch. I mean, right now, he's gotten a boost in February, these last 7, he's averaging almost 3-4 fantasy points per game more than he has on the season. So, I mean, he's a guy who, we really wanted to see that step forward. We've seen it a little bit, but man, I mean, he's just been really, and he can give you some monster games as well. So, I mean, he's just one of those guys, and especially I want to compare him to other guys in the honorable mentions and the rest of the centers that I think he just has a leg up upside wise compared to some other situations, even at his current situation. So I think he's a guy who deserves to be in the top 12, even if it's at the 12th spot.
Yeah, and kicking off the honorable mentions, you can stop wondering where this guy is. It's Karl Anthony Towns. Yes, we didn't forget about him. He's not, completely escaped our minds, but he didn't make the top 12 just because his injury it's pretty brutal. He's likely out until mid to late March, and we know how these injuries can go. It could be later. And so that's a pretty big blow, when you're talking specifically about fantasy, right? Because most of your guys' playoff games are going to be in early to mid-March. And so Cat might not make most of your impactful games for these fantasy games, and then obviously for the NBA reasons as well, just being out this long is pretty brutal. But there's no doubt that Cat's an impactful player and one of the top centers in fantasy basketball every year, averaging 21, 8, and 5. The assist numbers were up a good amount, even though the rebounding numbers were down because of Gobert. The assist numbers bumped up to kind of help supply that fantasy void for him, but just due to the injury, it's so hard, for a fantasy perspective to keep him in the top 12 when he's going to be out for maybe most of your playoffs.
For sure. And then next up here, another guy I'm sure a lot of people are wondering why he hasn't made the top 12, but it's DeAndre Ayton, and really it's just it's a couple things. First off, obvious Kevin Durant. So, adding an offensive guy like that. I know KD has not played yet for the Suns, but the expectation is he is back soon. So he's really going to impact the end of the NBA fantasy season here and into the playoffs for a guy like Ayton. And Ayton's really been in a really ideal situation for fantasy, right? Devin Booker's missed a ton of time this season. The Suns have been really riddled with injuries, and Ayton's really been able to benefit on top of that this season. And even with that, if you compare what Ayton has done on the season to what the bottom tier has done, if you're looking at Jaren Jackson, Miles Turner, Evan Mobley, all of them have outscored him in this most recent stretch. So if we're just looking at February, kind of 7 to 8, 9 games for these guys, I mean, they've outscored him by 3, 4, 5 fantasy points per game each from what Ayton has done this season. And that's not even considering what Ayton's fantasy production is going to look like when a guy like Kevin Durant adds into the Suns lineup, and it's KD, Devin Booker, soaking up a ton of offensive usage. So he's a guy where there's just not a lot to be excited about. And really, I think you could argue, even if KD wasn't there, I wouldn't argue if you had those other 3 guys ahead of him anyways.
Yeah, definitely. Next up here in the honorable mentions, got another shot blocker in my lap. Got Nicholas Claxton. We talked about the guys like Miles Turner, Jaren Jackson, who are also heavy shot blockers. Claxton's right up there, obviously, right? Almost 3 blocks a game. Having an incredible year for the Nets. Obviously they shipped the players off like Kyrie, KD, and them. And so he can get more involved offensively. We've had the time to kind of see where he would be involved in that offensively, but most of that usage is going to Dinwiddie, Mikal Bridges, Cam Johnson, Cam Thomas, Seth Curry. They just have a plethora of players now, so he's kind of staying around the same usage offensively and as far as shot volume goes, and so the amount that he's got right now just isn't enough to push him in the top 12, averaging 13 and 9, so close to double a game, but nothing crazy as far as ceiling goes for him on a night in and night out basis to kind of crack the top 12, even though he is a block monster. It's just 13 and 9 isn't sufficient enough to surpass the other block monsters like Miles Turner and Jaren Jackson, who are putting up 18, 17 points a game.
For sure. And then last honorable mention here, I do want to mention Şengün. He's a guy who we were excited about heading into the season. Really weird start if you just kind of think back to the start of the season where he wasn't even starting. He's had a really nice stretch at this point in the season with kind of the Rockets roster and some injuries around there, and obviously he's playing a lot more consistently. But really, it's just if you just compare him to what a lot of these other guys are doing, he's taken a nice step forward, but I don't think he's there from a consistency standpoint or even a production standpoint to put with anyone that we've talked about in the top 12. But I did want to mention him because I do really like him, and I think he does have a decent amount of upside here as we kind of finish out the season. Let us know if we missed any honorable mentions or anyone on the list. I will say that, if we're missing somebody and you think it's egregious or glaring, they probably are going to be in the top 12 forwards that we are also going to take a look at. But yeah, let us know in the comments, any questions or anything, or, if you think we missed anybody, or if you just love the list, let us know that as well. Appreciate you guys watching, and we will see you in the next one.